The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. This workshop uses process flow to create a custom registration form. This example registration form is for training purposes only. In no way does it replace the existing base registration form. Welcome to lesson 4 of Config Tools. So far we have shown you how we can create a registration form type and explored the schema designer, and together with UI hints we've created a more sophisticated registration form type. Now we'll turn to the registration form itself, the transactional part. Here we won't go step by step, but we will show you the BO already created and explain how we did it. And this is, being a transactional business object, it will have a life cycle, and that's the main topic here, to explore life cycle of a business object and everything related to the life cycle, as well as showing how the user interface can be also expanded to show action buttons by integrating other parts, fragments into the interface. Let's continue and now look at the business object that we need for the transaction registration form. In this particular case, I'm not going to go step by step adding in each element, but I will show you the elements that we will need in order to create the registration form. So I called my registration form simple, and used a custom CM reg form for the actual name of the BO. The underlying maintenance object is process flow, and the application service is process flow MO. Just like we had in the admin, we need an option type called portal nav option, which points to the portal that we use process flow. And then there's an extra option type called display map service script. This one we will look at in a moment, and we will see why it's necessary. But let's turn our attention now to the schema. The schema is the following. You see that we have enabled UI hints. We have added in a title, an input map title, just like we did for the admin as well, called the registration form in this case. And then we have a section called main. And then we have our primary key process flow ID, and you will see that we've set the prime key to be true. Now I've set it to suppress the heart so that I do not see the process flow ID in the main section, and you will see in a moment that the process flow ID is actually shown in the fragment on the right hand side under the record information, so that I actually do not need to show it on my left hand side. The process flow type is a field in the transaction process flow table, and it's mapped to process flow type. And I've set it to only show on the display map. On the input map, the process flow type is already inputted. You'll see that in a moment, so it's not necessary to be shown on the input map. The BO again has the standard foreign key to the business object, and it's mapped to the business object field. And I've suppressed showing the BO just like I did on the admin, because it's shown in the fragment on the right hand side. You'll see in a moment that the transaction process flow, in this case the registration form, has a life cycle, and therefore it has a status based upon the state of the life cycle, which we ourselves define. This is different than the admin object, which does not have a life cycle. We will look at the life cycle in a moment, but we have a field BO status, and again I am going to map it to the underlying field, and only show it on the display map. Because in the input map, it always starts in the initial state. There's also an extra field called status update date time. The time at which there has been a change of status. Again, this is a standard field that you will have on all transaction entities, new transaction entities. And again, it's hidden. And the reason why it's hidden is because, again, it can be shown on the fragment on the right-hand side. So therefore, it's not necessary. And we have the standard version field that we have on all tables, and all BOs. And we also have the creation date time that we also had on the admin side. Very similar way, we default the value to the current date time and also hide it so that it's not shown on the left hand side column, but will be shown on the UI fragment. And now we have other fields like user, the person who actually is accessing and using this particular process flow, and this is going to be defaulted to the current user in the system. So if I've logged in as user 00, then I will user 00 will be stamped on this particular BO. And again, only shown on display map. It's not needed in the input map. It's going to be automatically defaulted, so I don't need to show it. Now, I've added in a name field. I'm skipping person ID for a moment. Name is actually not on the actual fields. There's no actual field called name on a process flow, and that's why I've added it into the CLOB, and I've set it to come from the entity name. The entity name is the field on person name that is always filled in, and I'm going to fill in a name on my registration form, and then I will be creating my person with that name and using the person type as we've already seen on the admin object, which is set on the registration form type. So this is the name which I will fill in, and the person ID will eventually be the field I will use, which will be added to this particular process flow record when a person is actually created. Okay, this name is the name on the registration form. When the entity person is created, it will be updated on this form with a person ID. And in fact, the process flow has a person ID field, and therefore I didn't have to create it on a CLOB. There's a real field called person ID. Now, in the same way on the admin that we had fragments, so here as well we have fragments, and the fragments we'll discuss in a moment. The main difference, though, that you should see is record actions. There are actions based upon actually the life cycle of this transaction BO. And that's what I want to look at now. I want to turn our attention to the Lifecycle tab, where we will see that I have created a very simple life cycle for this registration form with a pending and an active state. And in the pending state is going to be something like what we see in front of you here. Description is pending. The access mode comes from the particular access modes which come from the application service. Go to the application service for a moment, which controls the security rights that a person has in order to access. We define here access modes, and we can actually link a specific access mode to a particular state of the life cycle. So at the moment, I've just used the standard access mode inquire, which is a general type of access that I have for that particular, and define that as long as a user has inquire rights, they will be able to access the pending state. We will discuss access modes later. This is the pending state is the initial state, so the status condition is set to initial. It's not a transitory state. We will also talk about that later. No alerts, and in display sequence is the first. I set it to 10. Now, let's go on to the next state. Let's skip the next status for a moment, and we'll come back to it in a few moments. The active state is, again, the state in which this registration form is going to be considered final. It's a final state, and it is in fact the place where I will be creating eventually the person entity. At the moment, you will see in a few minutes when I run this registration form, it doesn't do anything. It won't create any person, because I haven't created the code to do that. I haven't created the plugin to do that. Nonetheless, I have an active state, and this will be the place eventually where, under algorithms, I will be creating the actual person. Now, going back for a moment to the pending state, now that I have an active state, I'm able to actually set my next status on pending to be the active state. So I say next status is going to be the active state, and I can define a label, activate, from the pending state to say click on that activate action button, and it will take you to the active state. And here you can define a default state. We'll discuss transition conditions. You can define particular types of statuses, not by the actual names, but by the condition. And it is a way to more generalize your statuses in your code, so you don't have to actually access the actual names. You can use transition conditions, and we will see examples of using transition conditions later. And then we also define the transition role, about whether it is an internal process that actually does the transition. In that case, you use system, or whether actually a user online can do so as well as a back-end system. So then in that case, we use system and user. So at the moment, I've set it system and user, so that means that both online, both through the application, someone can click on a button called activate and move it to the active state, as well as in the background, the system can actually also do a similar type of action. I also have something called option types, which we will discuss shortly. Okay, so what we have at the moment is the schema with the fields and the lifecycle, a simple lifecycle. And I want to start by just looking to see now what will happen if I create a registration form using this BO. Okay, so let me go to the work management, and let me go to process flow. Let me choose the business registration form type which we have created previously. But suddenly I remember, before we do that, we need to look at that registration form type, make sure that the transaction BO is now pointing to the new registration form that BO that I've now created. So let me go to process flow type. Let me click on the broadcast business and see up below what are the settings for business registration form, and you will see that I've already updated the related transaction BO to point to registration form. Okay, I've already pointed it to the registration form, and that is correct because that is the process flow type I'm going to use, and it's going to use the registration form BO that we have now looked at. We just looked at the lifecycle, and we looked at the elements, the schema. So that's good. So that's fine. Let me now go back and create the process flow. And it comes up with an error saying business object is missing. Now, if you remember, in the first time that we looked at business object, I pointed out that we have to be very careful with the naming of the BO elements, because we already have scripts and menus that use the named elements in the code, and therefore since we are using these menus, we have to use the exact names. And if I look at the schema, the actual error that I'm getting is related to the fact that I'm using transbo, which is not the name of the actual element as defined in the code for the menus for process flow. And in fact, we have to use a different name, and it has to be the same named element that exists at the moment for the existing demo data process flow type BOs. What do I mean by that? Let me just show you. If I go to hardship, which is the default one in the system, you will see that it uses a transaction BO, and the name for the transaction BO is this trans business object CD, and that is the name I'm going to have to use as well for mine. For mine meaning for registration form type. Otherwise the code will not work, the menus will not work. So I'm going to have to change this name to that. Okay? Now that will mean, if you remember, this is the name I had there, which I thought was the correct one. I said use exact names. I made a mistake. It's this name that we need to have, and I'm going to save that because that is the name that we actually need to use. And now if I go and create a process flow, you will see that I'm able to continue. And the only field that we have allowed on the input map to show is the name. So let me just put in my name, David, and save that. You will see now that I have a process flow, a registration form. It's in pending state. I have the user. I have the user is the person who entered it, which is me, user 00. My name, the process flow type, business. I could actually add, and I should add, a foreign key so that that goes directly to the process flow type. I don't have that at the moment. And then I have a record actions. This is my fragment that I added in. And it allows me to edit, delete, or activate, which is the next state. And then we have the information like the process flow ID, the business object, and the other things that we moved and took away, we hid and did not show on the left hand side, and now are shown underneath on the right. Now, the reason why it was important for me to add in under my BO an extra option type, display map service script, is related to this fragment. Before looking at this, and this is already jumping into code, which we will discuss a lot in the next chapter, I want to show you why it was necessary to do so just practically, and then we can just talk about it generally, why it was important to add this, what's called a service script, without actually diving so much into the code yet. Let me remove it for a moment. Let me take away this particular option type. And now if I go back to my process flow, you will see that there are some differences. First of all, I don't have the buttons I had before of edit and delete. And if you look over here, I don't have my process flow ID, which I had previously. And that's because that as opposed to the admin fragment, it wasn't necessary to add any code to the fragment. in the case of the transaction BO, it is important to populate the fragment with extra data which comes from the business object. And that is ultimately the reason why I need this business object. I need this display map service script. Display map service script adds information to the fragment so that it is able to show and display the data correctly. I'm going to add it back in, and then we can look at for a moment to see what this display map service script does. Now, if I just go back to my process flow again, I just added it back in, you will see that, hey presto, I have edit and delete, and I have my process flow ID here again. And that just shows you that it was that script that was responsible for that. So, without going into enormous detail about how this works yet, let's just see generally what we have underneath this service script and see what is happening. In this service script, we have steps. We will discuss later the different steps. But if I open up this particular code again, and we're going to explain this in detail in the next chapter. We have three aspects that I want to just point out. One of them is to set the primary key, and this was what we did at this step over here. This was responsible for showing that process flow ID. We had to add the code in here. We showed the delete buttons, and we only show the delete button in pending state, but in the activate state you will not have a pending. You won't have, sorry, the delete button. And then also we have the edit buttons dependent upon something called a status category. Okay, I'm not going into any more detail to explain everything here. We will deal with this when we deal with the code. Just wanted to show you that this is the script where what is responsible for setting those that detail. But the one thing I do want to point out is that what we have done is a couple of things. First of all, in our life cycle, we have set in our pending state something called an option type called status category, and we've set it to basically be edit. This is a value which basically means edit, and because I have a status category edit, I am able to control that code. That service script is saying that if a status category is set to edit, then allow the edit button. In order to actually have an option type status category, one of the things that is important is that you set in your maintenance object particular fields of which particular option types are allowed. And in fact, I had to add in, and for this to work, a valid BO status option type C1CS, which means status category, SC standing for status category. Don't need to go into too much more detail. There's information here which describes where you find the lookup flags in order to set the values and look up the values correctly. I just wanted to point out again, there's a little extra work that was needed when it came to the transaction BO to set the fragment, as opposed to when we worked with the admin. It was pretty straightforward, and that was ultimately the reason for needing in my BO this particular display map service script. So again, I didn't want to go into the detail of what the code means. However, you saw three things that this script was doing. Number one, it was adding in the process flow ID into the. Let's have a look again. If I go to the process flow, it was adding in this particular process flow ID by moving the primary key ID and setting it. Second thing it was doing, it was saying that if I have a state which status category is set to edit, then the edit button is shown. That means in this state I'm able to change my name, and I also have set that in the pending state the delete button is shown. And then I have the activate button as well. Now if I do activate, you will see that the edit button and the delete will go away. And the reason is because the edit was only available on a status where that status category was set for edit. The delete's gone away because I only allowed a delete in pending. And since there's there are no further states, I don't obviously have an activate button because it's already active. Okay, so because this fragment is more dynamic than the admin one, we needed this display map service script. So we have seen in this lesson how you define the transaction registration BO. We've looked at its life cycle. On the way, when we looked at the life cycle, we've seen that the statuses have option types, and we've worked with the option types to work with display map server scripts. And even though that we haven't yet discussed scripting, nonetheless we had a small introduction to see how the action fragment works.